The smell of petrol hung around the driveway, vinyl seats were hot enough to burn your legs, and a big 6-cylinder Holden or Falcon could sit idling while the whole family climbed aboard. And number one, it involved something Australians once considered perfectly normal behind the wheel, something that today would be almost unthinkable. We'll get to it. Number 10. Holden Kingswood, 1971 to 1980. One of the strangest things about 1970s Australian motoring is how quickly people had to adapt to new safety rules. The Holden Kingswood was exactly the sort of large family car that filled Australian roads at the time. Big seats, a long bonnet, plenty of room for passengers and luggage, and engines designed for a country where long distances were simply part of life. But during the decade, something inside cars like these was changing. Seatbelts were becoming compulsory. The Australian design rules had already established requirements for seatbelts, and Victoria made wearing fitted seatbelts compulsory in December 1970. From January 1971, new cars had to have belts fitted to all seating positions, with other states and territories following with compulsory wearing laws by the early 1970s. Today, climbing into a car and deliberately ignoring a fitted seatbelt sounds bizarre. Back then, Australia was still changing an entire driving culture, and the next one takes that changing attitude toward family cars somewhere even stranger. Number 9. Ford Falcon, 1970s. Here's a detail most people miss. The 1970s family car wasn't just transportation. For many Australians, it was the place where the entire family travelled together, often for hours at a time. And the Falcon was one of the great Australian examples. Large bench-style seating, generous luggage space, and engines built for Australian roads made cars of this type useful for everything from the school run to long interstate journeys. But families also had very different ideas about where children should sit. Modern parents are used to purpose-built child seats, carefully designed restraints, and clearly defined anchorage systems. The 1970s were much less consistent. Australian research records the gradual introduction of child restraint requirements during the decade. Child restraint anchorages became part of the Australian design rules from 1976, while individual states introduced their own child restraint and seatbelt requirements at different times. And that brings us to one of the most extraordinary examples. Number 8. Morris Mini, 1959 to 1978 in Australian production. The little Mini could carry a surprising amount of family life inside its compact body, but the really shocking part isn't the size. It is what some Australian parents were once offered as a way to carry babies. In 1970, baby hammocks were marketed in Australia as a child car safety device. These were essentially suspended fabric hammocks inside the passenger compartment. The idea sounds unbelievable now, but it wasn't presented as a joke. It was part of a period when the science and regulation of child restraint systems were still developing. ABC's historical investigation documented the practice and the concerns surrounding these devices. Within the decade, Australia was moving toward proper child restraint standards and dedicated anchorage requirements. So one of the most surprising things about 1970s car culture isn't that people didn't care about safety, it's that our understanding of safety was changing underneath them, and we're only halfway down. Number 7. Toyota Corolla, 1970s Australian models. Today, most drivers expect a car to tell them when something is wrong. A warning light comes on. A service reminder appears. A diagnostic system knows where to look. A 1970s Corolla didn't have that luxury. Owners were far more accustomed to paying attention to the physical behavior of the car, the sound of the engine, the feel of the brakes, the temperature gauge, a strange vibration through the steering wheel, a new noise from underneath. Basic maintenance was much more visible to the owner because there was no electronic diagnostic system waiting to explain the problem. The Australian design rules were also progressively introducing requirements for things we now take for granted, including improved braking systems, steering components, windscreen systems, tires, safety rims, and head restraints. So keeping an older car going often meant knowing the machine rather than simply waiting for a computer to tell you what had failed. And that hands-on relationship with cars becomes even more interesting when alcohol enters the story. Number 6. Holden Torana, 1970s. There was a time when the idea of police randomly stopping an apparently normal driver and asking for a breath test was considered extraordinary. That is one of the biggest changes in Australian driving culture. Victoria introduced random breath testing in 1976. Before that, Breath testing existed, and laws concerning drink driving already existed, but random roadside testing represented something different. Police could stop motorists for testing even when there was no obvious sign of impairment or another offence. The first Victorian random testing site was established at East Bentley in 1976, and the reaction was strong. Some people regarded the idea as an unacceptable intrusion on motorists, others worried about its effect on pubs and businesses, but the system remained. Other states followed progressively, with nationwide adoption taking place over subsequent years. Think about how different that sounds from today. A driver could once see the police and worry about whether they were visibly impaired. Then the rules changed. Suddenly the question became much simpler. Had you been drinking? And from here, the habits get even more surprising. Number 5. Ford Falcon, 1970s. For many Australians, a car was something you didn't just drive. You worked on it. That meant opening the bonnet at home, checking fluids, listening to the engine, and getting your hands dirty. There was no modern engine management system storing fault codes for you. A problem might begin with a rough idle, a strange smell, or a noise that wasn't there yesterday. The owner, a neighbor, or a local mechanic had to work it out. That mechanical relationship explains something that can be easy to forget today. Cars of this era were comparatively understandable machines. They still required skill, tools, and knowledge, but many faults could be approached directly. A bonnet went up. You looked, you listened, you checked, you adjusted, you replaced something, and the car went back onto the road. For an Australian family on a tight budget, keeping an existing car alive could matter just as much as buying a new one, but there was another part of 1970s motoring that modern drivers might find even harder to understand. Number 4. Holden Commodore, 1978 to 1980. The late 1970s brought a new kind of Australian family car, but the expectations surrounding road trips had already been established. People expected cars to cover serious distances. There was no smartphone sitting in the passenger's hand, no navigation app calculating the next turn, no live traffic display warning about congestion ahead. A long journey depended much more heavily on preparation, road knowledge, and whatever information the driver had available. And that mattered in Australia because distances could be enormous. A family travelling between major cities could spend hours on the road, and the car had to be ready for it. That meant thinking about fuel, tyres, cooling, luggage, and the condition of the vehicle before leaving. The modern assumption that a car can simply be driven until something happens would have been a poor strategy. In a 1970s family car, preparation was part of ownership, and if you think the safety changes were already dramatic, wait until you hear what happened to the way people thought about children in cars. Number 3. Chrysler Valiant, 1970s. The large Australian family sedan was also a family room on wheels, and that created a habit modern safety advice has completely transformed. Children were not always treated as separate passengers who required purpose-built restraint systems. The rules themselves were developing throughout the decade. The Australian government's historical occupant protection records show state-by-state changes in child restraint and seatbelt requirements during the 1970s. In some jurisdictions, rules arrived in stages and covered different age groups and seating positions. By the late 1970s, requirements were considerably more developed than they had been at the beginning of the decade. That's important because the decade shouldn't be remembered simply as a time when Australians didn't care about safety. The opposite is closer to the truth. It was a decade of rapid change. The car itself was changing, the law was changing, and families were slowly learning that the back seat wasn't simply an extension of the lounge room. We're almost at number 1 now, and the final habit isn't just about a piece of equipment or a road rule. It's about the attitude Australians once had toward driving itself. Number 2. Holden Kingswood and Ford Falcon, the great Australian family cars of the 1970s. One thing Australians once accepted was just how physically demanding long-distance motoring could be. A big road trip wasn't necessarily a quick drive with everything arranged around comfort. The car had to cope with heat, distance, rougher roads, and the possibility that help might be a long way away. That encouraged a practical approach to ownership. Check the car, check the tyres, know the fuel situation, pay attention to the temperature, listen for unusual noises, carry what you might need. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sensible. The cars themselves were increasingly subject to national design requirements covering tyres, braking, steering, lights, windscreen systems, and other safety equipment. The second edition Australian design rules began in 1969 and expanded through the 1970s, with new requirements taking effect throughout the decade. So while the cars could still feel enormous and relatively simple compared with today's vehicles, The foundations of modern Australian vehicle safety were being built underneath them, and now we're down to number one. This is the one that most clearly shows just how different Australian driving culture could be. Number 1. Holden Kingswood, Ford Falcon, and the Australian family car of the 1970s. People once accepted that drinking and driving could be part of an ordinary social evening. Not everyone did it, of course, but the culture around drink driving was dramatically different from what Australians expect today. The evidence behind the change is stark. In Victoria, random breath testing began in 1976, after years of concern about alcohol-related crashes. Contemporary research found that drink driving was a major contributor to serious road trauma, and the introduction of random testing represented a major change in enforcement. The idea of being stopped without having committed another obvious offence was initially controversial, but the system changed behaviour, and eventually it changed culture. That may be the most surprising thing about 1970s Australian car ownership. It wasn't simply that cars were different, the rules around them were different, the expectations were different, and some habits that seemed completely ordinary at the time would be almost impossible to defend today. Seatbelts became compulsory, child restraints became progressively regulated, cars became subject to increasingly detailed safety requirements, drivers became more accustomed to breath testing, and the relationship between the owner and the machine remained much more hands-on than it is today. Look at an old Kingswood, Falcon, Tirana, Valiant or Corolla now, and it's easy to see only the chrome, the vinyl, the big steering wheel and the sound of an old engine. But these cars also tell the story of how Australian motoring changed. The 1970s were a bridge between an older style of driving and the much more regulated, safety-conscious road culture we know today. And perhaps that's why these cars still have such a strong place in Australian memory. They weren't perfect. Neither were the habits surrounding them. But they were part of a period when Australians were learning, sometimes painfully, how to make cars safer without losing the freedom and practicality that made motoring so important. So here's the question. Which 1970s Australian driving habit surprised you the most? The old child restraint practices, the early attitude towards seatbelts, or the arrival of random breath testing? I read every comment, and if you enjoy these stories about the cars and driving culture that shaped Australia, like the video and subscribe to Sunburnt Chrome.